Chair, I'm looking forward to future contributions from the Minister on this bill and perhaps a little more enthusiasm for maybe a second or third intervention, because it is a fairly significant piece of work that the Minister is presenting to us today, and of course will have significant implications for those working in this sector. As was already indicated in the first second reading of this bill, there will be a doubling of the number of people in this sector who will be required to essentially be registered, from around 9,000 to 18,000. And I know one of my colleagues in the committee stages of this bill will be seeking further clarification from the Minister over his expectations of the level of discretion that will be exercised for the granting of some of those licences, given there will be some already operating in the sector who may not have been required to be registered, but who may fall outside of what some of the expectations in this bill may have set in terms of qualification, background checks, etc. So it'll be interesting to have that discussion and seek further clarification from the Minister in that regard. I, though, wish to go back to the debate that was started in the last reading of this bill around Clause 66, because this obviously was a bill that was initially drafted by Labor and introduced in 2008. So for the large part, there's little contention between both Labor and National on this bill, with the exception of Clause 66. And just to give a bit of background, I thought it might be useful to spend some time looking at what that clause originally said before it was struck out by the government members at Select Committee. And it sets out the private investigator or employee not to take photographs or make recordings without consent. Now, this provision is based on the status quo of what the old legislation, which I think dated back to the 1950s from memory. And that set out that no person may, in the course or in connection with the business of a private investigator, take or cause to be taken or use or accept for use any photograph, any cinematographic picture, videotape recording of another person without the prior consent in writing of that other person. And that included recording devices as well. So essentially it's saying that if someone is going to, as a private investigator, be contracted by someone else to monitor the movements, either via video recording or through photographs, they cannot do it unless they have the written consent of the person that they're following. Now, on face value, that may seem to defeat the purpose of following someone covertly if you then have to go and seek their permission for their photos to be taken or used. And of course, we acknowledge that in Select Committee that there was a difficulty there, and that perhaps this provision was too prescriptive. But we weren't satisfied that simply deleting it was a fair middle ground. We heard from some submitters that the restrictions of Clause 66 would inhibit private investigators who are investigating criminal activity, and that therefore that outweighed any concerns that may exist around privacy. And so, of course, they were advocating the clause come out altogether. But I think it's important that we're mindful here that not all of the work this provision covers would have been investigation around criminal activity. In fact, probably some of the more frequent activity may simply be for, perhaps, for instance, marital disputes. Perhaps, for instance, almost following famous individuals, or even we have heard examples and seen examples of politicians having their privacy invaded in this way. And this was a clause that did prevent that until now, because of course it has been removed. And the consequence of that is that if an adequate code of conduct is drafted, we essentially have a case where these private investigators have wider powers than the police. If you compare what we have here with the search and surveillance bill which the Justice and Electoral Select Committee is currently considering. And that is also one of the concerns that was raised by the Select Committee, the fact that we have at the moment two pieces of legislation in the mix. This one, Mr Chair.
Call Jacinda Ardern.
Thank you, Mr Chair. We have this bill. We also have the search and surveillance legislation, which the Justice and Electoral Select Committee is considering, and also the Law Commission is doing a report on privacy, and that we run the risk of having a lack of cohesion and inconsistent response to the issue of privacy, and some individuals may wind up with greater powers than others, and this was a concern of the Select Committee. So how could we have resolved that? Well, in the end, I do want to look at Clause 106, which sets out the regulations which will be subsequently drafted, which will remedy some of the issues we looked at as a Select Committee. And for the large part, a lot of these regulations, I am happy for them to be set outside of the ambit of the Select Committee and in consultation with the sector, because by and large they sit around things like prescribing forms, the setting of fees, and perhaps one of the more significant ones inserted by the Select Committee, the prescribing of the competency, knowledge and skills required by applicants for licences and certificates. Acknowledging, I think, here that the sector has a huge role to play in setting out its own expectations and standards for the industry, and I think that's good and proper. Of course, we have the Regulation Review Committee who will have oversight, particularly around the fees that will then be set. But where I think perhaps we've gone a step too far in setting out and allowing a code of conduct to be set outside of the ambit of this House. And I do have some questions for the Minister, because in 106A we see here, this is, I guess, the counterweight to the removal of Clause 66, and that is that the Minister must recommend that the Governor-General make regulations to be enforced at all times on and after 1 December 2010. I imagine that's changed by the SOP. Prescribing a code of conduct containing matters that the Minister is satisfied are necessary or desirable in relation to the surveillance of individuals by private investigators and private investigator employees. So it's very broad. We don't have a sense at this stage of how comprehensive that code of conduct will be, or the expectations of the Minister or the Government. So I do have a couple of questions. Firstly, what role the Minister envisages the Law Commission's report on privacy will play in developing that code of conduct, whether there will be any interaction there or simply whether or not the timelines are out of kilt. The expectations of the Minister for that code of conduct, or essentially are we beginning with a blank canvas? So if he has some expectations, I would be interested to hear them. Who will be involved in the drafting of the code of conduct? Because there are a number of various interested parties when it comes to these matters. And will the government have, what mechanisms is the government building in to essentially change this code of conduct if compliance either becomes an issue, because this is obviously what you need to take into account when we do look at forms of pseudo self-regulation, and how he will build in the prerogative to change this code of conduct if it is inadequate. And just to restate, certainly Labour's position on this issue, and I also believe it's a position shared by the Greens, our preference was that Clause 66 was retained, acknowledging that it did need to be amended, however. But our view was that it should be retained, and then once the Law Commission's review had been completed, that we then make an amendment to Clause 66, and our intention is to move an SOP along those lines. Okay. And whether or not the government wishes to then come back with a compromise around, for instance, the fact that we could retain Clause 66 but build in agreement that when the Law Commission finishes its report that we cooperate in ushering through an amendment so that we don't have a full lengthy House procedure around that. I think that would be a good compromise and ensure that we get around all of the issues around a coherent response to privacy issues, which is certainly what we're advocating. I know that Law Commission has already advocated that there be a Security Devices Act and new offences for recording and tracking, and I think again this demonstrates where we are. There is a significant overlap in all of the work that's being done, and it does make sense to slow down when it comes to this particular provision. If we get it wrong, it will be hard, I think, to backtrack and rewrite history, as it were, when we are expecting an entire industry to change